Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell, as always. Paddy, how are you this week?
I am absolutely positively fantastic, Gary. How are you?
I'm great. Delighted to hear it. My room is a bit messy, so if you are watching this on the old YouTube and you see the video, I've just moved house, so we've got a lot of bags that need sorting. So I do apologize for the lack of domestic discipline displayed in this podcast.
It's one of Jordan Peterson's key rules, tidy your room. It's really funny though, because there's so many memes of him in an absolutely dirty
Very messy
mess.
room.
So
Yeah.
messy, yeah.
To be fair, since he's returned, his room has been impeccably clean, and I'm admiring. He's back on the path.
You'd love to see it, but in fairness, what has he been doing for the last 2 years?
Cleaning his room.
Cleaning his room, clearly.
Anyway, purpose of this podcast is to follow on from last week. Last week, we had a discussion primarily focused on economics, I guess, really, more than anything else. Philosophy,
economics, philosophy, politics.
They're all intertwined. It's politics and philosophy all the way down, really, when you're talking about any topic. So there you go. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about food stuff, more or less. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on what we discussed last week, all of which related, I guess, to big picture economic systems, how that relates to obesity and increasing prevalence of obesity. And that's clearly going to be related to the food environment, food industry, all those sorts of variables. And the reason we want to discuss this, and the reason that we recorded the last episode as well, is because this is obviously an underappreciated area of obesity causality when it comes to the personal training and fitness industry generally. And that's understandable because as personal trainers, we, including me and Patty, work with individuals. So we work with people and we get to analyze their behavior on an individual level. We see repeated trends between people, and we see repeated places where we can intervene on the individual level to make change. However, those micro level changes and causes of someone overeating, for example, do not actually inform us about the big picture causes. Because if we were to zoom out and ask ourselves, why has obesity been rapidly increasing in prevalence, not just in the Western world, but across the world over the last 50 years? Why has that happened? And, you could say, oh, it's just because everyone just started to become less disciplined because we got the internet and maybe they lost willpower. But it doesn't really hold true when you actually look into it. It doesn't really make any sense. Has that really happened? And obviously the answer is no. But we can identify things that have changed, that have contributed to food availability on a mass scale. It's very easy to buy food. It's very cheap to buy food. And it's very easy to buy cheap foods that are very energy dense. And that's primarily what we kind of see as the big picture causal factor. If you were to reduce it down, it's pretty much the availability and the demand for energy dense, cheap foods. That's fun. There's other things that are related to it, obviously, urbanization, more sedentary lifestyles, all those sorts of things, but they do kind of all come together to make the situation very much one that's been driven by the economic environment more than anything else.
Yeah, like you said, this is often forgotten about because people do focus on obesity researchers, for example, as well. It's not just personal trainers. A lot of them will be focused on the individual intervention because ultimately that's all they're really empowered to do. They look at it what can an individual do, right? And that's great because obviously we're a big advocate of that. We help individuals. I'm not writing policy for my country here. I'm not smart enough to do that. But it makes sense to focus on the individual, right? Because we also have this narrative in society that we are an individualistic society. We value the individual, and it makes sense then to go, how do we deal with obesity? Let's focus on the individual, right? And as we've been discussing over this entire obesity series, there is far more to the situation of obesity than just what the individual has control of, And we talked about it before in terms of, socioeconomic status. And obviously now we're talking about what we mean by that socioeconomic status in some degree. Like, we're not actually talking about the socioeconomic status itself. We're talking about the situation in the world that leads to that disparity, right? Not to say now that if we had not got neoliberalism, right, that disparity wouldn't be even increased. For example, again, we can look at China, which we'll look at in a second, in terms of their economics, and they're supposed to be, a communist dictatorship, right? So you would think, as a communist dictatorship, we are for the workers, we are for the people. This is what people in the West, they're like, oh, these like more communist style policies, are the things that are going to close this disparity in terms of, the lower class and the upper class, right? But in China, you probably have the most glaring difference in this disparity. Like, you could go to, a really built up urban Chinese city and see people that are majorly affluent, right? Like, have huge amounts of money, just like you would see in a Western country, a developed country, like America, for example, right? But all you have to do is go to the countryside and you see people in complete abject poverty, right? Now, the Chinese government is doing stuff to combat that. I actually think some of the policies they do, and like as we've discussed in the last episode, I don't agree with the Chinese government, and I'm probably as far right as you can be compared to the Chinese government. But I agree with some of their policies in terms of, they're actually giving poor people, like farmers, like cows, right? Because again, then they can breed the cows, they can sell them for meat, they can do whatever, right? And so they are trying to offer a way out of the situation. However, the situation still remains the case that there is a huge disparity in terms of, socioeconomic status between the lowest and the highest in China as well, right? So again, we have to be aware of, when we are talking about this stuff, that, there are unintended consequences of every action that we take, right? And there's probably not one singular way. Like, say communism might be great at solving this issue, but neoliberalism might be great at solving this other issue, right? And we unfortunately don't have a very good way of knowing ahead of time what's going to happen, right? Like, we can look to the past and see what's happened. Like, for example, again, you can look at any communist, dictatorship in the past, and even the current one, current ones. It's like these are not great places to live if you aren't, for that party. But that's the same with all dictatorships, right? But there's huge things, or huge. There are things that can go wrong regardless of the economic policies we enact, right? So I want you to keep that in mind as we do get through this podcast, because it really does bear keeping in mind in terms of, someone can sell you a narrative. Like, effectively, we're trying to sell a narrative here, but I'm going to say at the end of the episode that I don't know what the fuck to do, right? Like, I'm going to say that right now. I'm like, I don't have an answer to this, as I said, I'm not smart enough, right? But that's the case with a lot of the policies that are brought in. There are unintended consequences to all of them, right? And we have to be aware of that, right? So I suppose we'll get cracking on the actual, like, what we're actually talking about when we're talking about this neoliberalism-led nutrition transition and what has led to the obesity epidemic, crisis, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think even though you could easily start in Britain or you could start in America, like the trend for that, it's kind of dragged out over a number of years. And it's actually probably easier to use something like China, as I said, as a case study, because the process has kind of been condensed. We could use an African country as well, but there's probably not as much research on that as there is in China, because the Chinese are also doing their own research. Not to say that African countries aren't doing their own research, but the Chinese have really invested a lot into research in the last few years. So we have a lot more data points for them, right? So do you want to talk about the nutrition transition in Asia, particularly in China?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, if you have any, rudimentary understanding of Chinese history, as I would regard my own understanding, like, China didn't exactly have a great food environment in the mid 20th century, to say the least.
Ever, really, at all. If you look past any of their history.
Yes, but when it came to the 1970s, then China basically had significant economic reform under Deng Xiaoping. And that basically led to a more kind of liberal economic system, whereby you had more private industry, you had more foreign investments eventually, and all of this stuff led to rapid economic growth in China over the subsequent decades. But as with many cases where you have an improvement in one metric, there's basically side effects or trade-offs that comes with that. Okay, so China had absolutely over the last 50 years or 40 years, they've had great economic improvements in terms of GDP, in terms of lifting people out of poverty, in terms of average wage, etc. All that has improved. But much like when you look at indices of pollution, for example, you might consider that to be a negative externality in economic terms. And China rates very poorly when it comes to pollution in that period of time as well. I think like 120th in the world in terms of their environmental index. But another negative externality you might consider to be part of that process is that of obesity. And obesity prevalence in China has basically just been like a linear kind of like stepwise trend over subsequent decades at like 20%, I think in 1990? Yeah, around 1990, then 30% 10 years later, and then 40% again 10 years later. And it's just been making this stepwise increase. And one of the things that you tend to see is that there's sort of like a bit of it's almost like the food market or food industry basically kind of pokes in a little bit, and we'll talk about this later as it relates to sugar sweetened beverages. But effectively what happens is you get a little bit of infiltration of, a fast food company. For example, fast food's an easy example. Like the first McDonald's opened both in Russia and in China in 1990. And initially that would have been something that would have been viewed as, American symbolism fundamentally. It was a kind of Western symbolism. Oh, we have a McDonald's. That's more, it was initially viewed as more of like something you might do as like a weird occasion, like, oh yeah, we'll go and try a McDonald's. But eventually, as you get American symbolism removed, you get competition between different fast food outlets within different areas. It eventually becomes just the norm. And that's effectively what happened, where it just became normalized for things like fast food consumption. And one of the things that we would generally regard as being, I guess, a big win from a capitalism or neoliberalism perspective is that when you introduce, a well-established business like McDonald's, all other businesses have to step up their game, okay? Because if you're going to compete with McDonald's, delicious food, cheap food, then you need to really do a great job. So then basically what you have is you have this case where other fast food companies, both Chinese owned and multinational corporations like KFC, Pizza Hut, etc., you've got competition that's taking place there. So you get, different companies, different restaurants emulating their food models, how they run things, all those sorts of things that we would typically regard as being beneficial economic competition. Because, if you've got lots of different companies competing to have the best product, then that's ultimately good for the consumer because, well, now we get better products. Like, that's fantastic. That's one of the great things that we would typically consider about capitalism. But one of the downsides there is that when we're talking about food, we're basically making the food better is appealing to our monkey brains effectively, appealing to the fact that we're very responsive to high fat, high sugar, high salt foods, really tasty, energy dense foods. And that's what we're going to respond to. And that's what we're going to typically consume more of and come back for more. So that
To
go
say
ahead.
on that as well, like when you think about it from just a pure like capitalist perspective, if you are a McDonald's franchisee, you're looking to go somewhere like in China, you're not going to go to the countryside. You're not going to go to this, area where people, probably have more active lifestyles. No, you're going to go to the urban areas where there's a tower block there with whatever fucking 20,000 people in it, because you have a huge market right on your doorstep, right? But also these people have sedentary lives as well because they're urbanites, they probably have an office job, whatever, right? So again, it's hard to dissociate like oh, it's just the food that has changed. Like the whole world has changed. The whole like nutrition, I don't know, environment overall has changed.
Yeah, and that is actually a really, really important point because it's something you see come up time and time again, and it's actually important to discuss with regards to Western countries as well, because like the food environment is molded within the broader environment and the broader way of life. And for example, when it comes to urbanization, if you've got a rapid economic development within a busy city, you're going to have effective public transport mechanisms that minimize the need for me to walk anywhere, that minimize the need for me to cycle, for example. You're typically going to have booming industry with jobs and people working all day, and obviously in the modern environment that often involves sedentary work. And if you are someone that's really busy and trying to get ahead, that might also mean you spending less time preparing food. And if you have more money and food is cheap, it's obviously very easy for you to go out and eat your lunch while you're out. And that's one of the things you typically see with economic development, including China. I think that, yeah, they had a 500% increase in food consumed outside the home from like 1990 to 2010. And that's something that you see in the West as well, and that you see all over the world as countries begin to develop. So all of these things are intertwined together. And you can even bring that down to things like the family unit and the values that you hold within a particular country. Some authors have even suggested that, for example, as you bring more women into the workplace, then what you've got is you've got a man and a woman in that type of relationship where the husband and wife are both at work all day. Okay, so there's no time for food preparation if they're both, again, trying to get ahead. And again, you have less time for food preparation and less time for cooking, less time for sitting down to a family meal because you're getting after it. So all those sorts of things are what end up pushing you to eat a certain diet or eat certain foods or make the food environment suit you more. Obviously, that's...
You don't even
Go
have
ahead.
to like go to China to see that. Like
Yeah,
most people
exactly.
listening to this, like you probably know you and your partner, you come home after your whatever 9 to 6. Like I know obviously a lot of personal trainers listen to this, so that it doesn't necessarily apply to them. But like you come home from your 9 to 6 or whatever job it is that you have, the two of you are fucking knackered, and you sit down, you flop down on the couch, and you're looking at each other going, ah, yeah, look, we'll order that pizza. So like neither of you wants to cook. Neither of you is like, oh, like let's go into the kitchen, rustle up a nice fucking, I don't know, meat and veg meal. Like you're just like, no, like I want food now. It's quick and easy. Or one of you texts each other, or the other one, I should say, and it's like on the way home, will I pick up a Chinese, or like what, like that kind of stuff goes on. And again, it's understandable when you consider that the two of you are working 8+ hours per day, and you come home tired.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the important thing to get here as well is that when you're going through these topics, and this is what makes it challenging to discuss the vast majority of the time, is that like you can't just view it as a good bad binary. Like it's just not how it works, because for example, like things like economic development are very clearly good things. They're the things that we would generally be in favor of. We're not going to say that, oh, we should go in the opposite direction, because then you've got poverty and starvation, which is not good either. So it's ultimately a case of trade-offs. Like we're not going to say that, oh yeah, let's make it policy that women aren't allowed to work so that they have to stay home and cook for their husbands. Like that's clearly absurd. Or vice versa, that men can't work and they're going to stay home and cook so that the family can be healthy. So you have to accept that there are certain things that do go along with economic development and urbanization, and the advancement of society towards more sedentary work, etc., that we just kind of are where we are, and we have to deal with where we are. Because I think what some people do is they kind of just say, no, I don't want to be here, and let's bomb our way back to a past society, a hunter-gatherer society. There's examples of where that has happened. But yeah, basically, don't think of this as a good bad binary, because you won't come up with any effective solutions, I think. um yeah, I'm sure you won't disagree with that. But yeah, there's also other factors I think that are interesting when it comes to things like fast food consumption, for example, that you often wouldn't think about, and that I've only thought about when I've gone abroad sometimes. And that is that, like, fast food consumption and big companies with many franchises are actually very reliable and safe. Okay. And that's one of the things that does come up and has come up in some of the reading I've done. Like, I haven't been to China, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But for example, if you were concerned about food hygiene and you're concerned about food safety, a multinational corporation like McDonald's is probably going to have higher food safety standards than some of the fast food stalls in down an alleyway in China, for example.
In Wuhan, like, or
Yeah, yeah, in Wuhan, exactly. Yeah, perfect timing. Um, but that actually is something to consider as well. And one of the things that's often not appreciated about large fast food corporations is that they've got repeatable processes that have been refined over time in very strict safety standards. Obviously, that varies by country and legal requirements, etc. And I think McDonald's did actually have a bad time in Japan in terms of they had a big loss of market value because something was found in the food and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, those variables do come into play when it comes to fast food consumption as well. So overall, what you've got when you take all these factors and you mold them together, effectively what you've got in China is where they've basically moved away from more of typically a higher carbohydrate and lower fat diet, if you were to classify it very simply, and towards one that is obviously higher in overall calories, higher in fat from a percentage basis, and lower in carbohydrates from a percentage basis. But something that we were discussing before we got on the podcast is that breaking things down in terms of purely percent macronutrients doesn't always give you the full story, because obviously you have to think about the overall increase in calories as well. Because while many people do say that, oh, obesity is just a result of eating more carbs or whatever, carbohydrates on a percentage basis have actually gone down in China and tend to go down with this nutrition transition in all countries. And fats have gone up, but overall, like, you're talking about increases in absolute quantities in many cases, particularly then when you start to look at the types of foods consumed. Obviously, when you're increasing calories, it's not like processed foods and fast foods and foods consumed outside the home are generally healthful. That's generally not the case. So you're talking about a move away from the traditional diet, increases in things like vegetable oils, more animal food consumption. But when we say animal food, like, it's not like people are getting, lean chicken breasts, rice, and broccoli. Like, you're talking about more cheaper meats, fattier meats, etc. All of those things can contribute significantly to overall fat content then, and obviously overall calorie content as well. So that is kind of the general worldwide trend that you see when it comes to the nutrition transition, is that move away from a diet that's probably a bit more plant-based, not necessarily like a deliberate vegan plant-based diet, but more of an agrarian diet, I guess you could say, towards one that is typically more dominant of processed foods, fast foods, high calorie, high fat, high sugar, high salt foods.
yeah, like I was reading 2 or 3 papers there, and I kind of summarized it myself in a few bullet points. I'm just going to read them out here because
Yeah, go ahead.
it basically summarizes exactly what Gary said. So the classic like Chinese diet shifted from cereals and low-fat mixed dishes to being replaced by a westernized diet. Cereal and vegetable intake decreased, and intake of animal foods, processed foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, and ultra-processed foods high in energy, fat, sugar, and salt increased. There was a decrease in cereals and vegetables and an increased intake in animal foods, with pork dominating in the Chinese market. Cooking oil and salt intake increased, and it's far above even the Chinese recommendations. And it basically went from a high carb diet to a high fat diet, but like Gary said, like, it went to a high calorie diet, right? That's how you should think of it. It's like, well, you can look at the percentages, it doesn't tell the whole story, right? They went from like a lower animal intake to a high animal intake, and like Gary said, it's not just the animal products we have to look at, it's like the overall calories and macronutrients that we get from those animals. Like, if you went from, I don't know, eating lean chicken breast to eating pork belly, like, obviously you could say like, oh, the same amount of animal products is eaten, but there's a significant difference there. Whole grains were replaced with more processed grains. There's an increase in consumption of prepackaged foods and eating away from the home. And there was a shift from an agriculture and labor intensive industry to a sedentary industry. And on top of that, ownership of televisions, electronic products increased considerably, representing a major potential cause of reduction of outdoor activities overall, you know? So like all of those things were happening at the same time. So it's hard to say like, oh, it was this thing that caused it, right? But I also don't want you to think about it was this thing, and I don't want you to think of it like, oh, it's just the food that we have to worry about. Like it's everything that we have to worry about. Well, worry is the wrong word. It's everything we have to think about, right? And also, while we're focusing on China, this stuff did happen in Britain. This stuff did happen in America, right? It actually, we could say it kind of started in America and then it moved out, especially to the Anglosphere, but also then throughout Europe, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, and again, it is this kind of weird shift. And I was saying to Gary earlier on, like you could see like in America and Britain, right? They basically got it happening over a longer time frame, right? Like you can look at classic examples is actually in America, you can see the transition from like Native Americans or indigenous, whatever like the politically correct term is, people who actually are from America, they were there for thousands of years, whatever, they're non-European, right? When they were exposed then to that European, Western style diet, like there was, huge ramifications in that. And obviously like that's mixed in with, huge upheaval in, their whole living situation, like, especially with the Americans breaking all those treaties. But, all of this stuff, again, it makes sense to think of it as well. But you can see the change, the nutrition transition in those populations as well, where they were going from this, traditional, we'll say hunter-gatherer lifestyle, even though obviously that wasn't the case for all of them. But they went from that to being on a reserve. The Americans just put them on a reserve. And then they were also, effectively subsidized. Like the American government looked after them, air quotes on looked after, and they fed them like a Western diet, and you just see rapid rates of obesity, failing health, and issues around that, because again, like you've taken away first of all the meaning and purpose in these people's lives, because you've taken their land. They're a conquered people now, right? But also then you start introducing other things which, it's not necessarily as relevant to this conversation that we're having, but it is obviously relevant when we're talking about the larger picture. You start introducing things like, free access to tobacco. Well, I say free access, easier access to tobacco and alcohol, and again, this is why you have such high rates of like alcoholism in those Native American populations. It's like, this was kind of like subsidized. Now, do I think it was like maliciously done? I don't know. It's up to you to read the research and see if that's the case. But either way, it was done. And this stuff all does play into account. And you can see, probably if you look up the Pima Indians, you can see this. There's a lot of research on those, that particular group of Indians. There's a lot of research on those that you can kind of read through and see this kind of an early manifestation of this nutrition transition going on, right? But you should also look at it in the larger context of what was going on across the Anglosphere, especially in America. And then from the 1970s onwards, when we really started ramping up this globalization as a result of this neoliberal policy and, the reduction in, trade barriers, and where effectively now we were able to have these, mass economies of scale, right? Like, again, like this is after the industrial revolution of like the second or the third one of standardization. So now we had these mechanized processes, and we had this idea of like, let's make our cooking environment, like say McDonald's or something, like a factory. It's like, oh, you have one person that just fries the fries. It's like that's all they do. So they can just pump out that. It's not like there's one chef in there making a whole meal from scratch, because that's just not, it's not scalable, right? And you had a more scalable, or a move towards a more scalable nutrition environment. And as a result then, with the reduction in trade barriers as well, it's like, okay, now we can scale this across the world, especially with like someone like or a company like McDonald's, where like their economic policy isn't actually, to make burgers. Their economic policy is to buy land. Like that's how McDonald's makes their money. Like McDonald's as a corporation will buy the land and effectively lease it to the franchisee, so that's how they make their money, right? They couldn't care less if the franchisee is making money on the burgers they sell, because they're making money on the rent, and it's interesting as well, because like obviously we're focusing on this in terms of like obesity, but it is the case in other areas, and we don't necessarily quite join it up. And this is something we'll talk about probably in a little bit, in terms of like the socioeconomics of this, in terms of where these companies and stuff locate in these urban environments, usually in these lower socioeconomic environments, because again, they know they have a class of people that, you know, they're going to buy the food, and they know that there's a lot of them around. So if I can offer them cheap food and it's less time consuming, you know, you can feed your family for whatever, €20, rather than having to cook the food, which you have to then take into account the time investment on that, and you have to store the food, you know, whatever. Like, you look at that, but it's also the case in these, you know, upper class or higher class environments where, you know, you'll have like 20 Starbucks within like a fucking 10-mile radius of each other, you know. And like, if you go to LA, for example, it's like, like, why is there so much, like, so many of these same stores in the same areas? And again, then you can just go to a, you know, a lower class or a less privileged area in LA, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, those Starbucks now they're being replaced by, like, I don't know, Jack in the Box and, you know, whatever else, other like McDonald's, KFC, whatever, you know. So again, it's hard to just say, oh, this is all the company's fault, because all they are doing is chasing profit. But because other companies are doing it in different ways, we kind of don't look at them as poorly, because they're taking advantage of, you know, different people, like these like affluent you know, upper class Americans. They're like, oh, who cares? Like, Starbucks, get your fucking venti mocha choco fucking whatever invention. They're like, who cares, right? But then again, we shifted over to all these McDonald's in this area, this lower class area, and again, then we start focusing on it more of the problem. So it's a hard one to really tease out the details, especially when we're looking at, like, how do we solve this? But yeah, I kind of just went off on a tangent there.
Yeah, no, you're dead right. And I think that there's also something to be said for the role of culture in all this, because I suppose, like, when you think about the globalization, fundamentally, like, we're not just moving towards like free trade across the world and everyone having access to all different types of machines and social media and all that, but through media being, you know, connected between countries on other sides of the world, you basically get this kind of narrowing or convening of culture as well, in terms of things that are enjoyed, things that are embraced, and you get the loss of tradition, which is, you know, quite sad, but a very much a reality. You know, you see that with social media, with people, you know, catching on to American trends really quickly, you know, people worrying suddenly about American problems in places like Cork, Ireland, you know, and thinking that they're relevant here when they're not. All those types of things also play a role, and it plays a role in food. Like, for example, with in China, as you get more exposed to, and to be fair, now in China, like, they do have significant restrictions on Google, social media, etc. But there's still a growing exposure over time towards the West, towards those types of ways of living. And you could imagine how that would relate to anywhere in the world. You know, if you're living somewhere that's quite poverty stricken, and then eventually you get access to media and you're seeing these things in these amazing countries thousands of miles away, and you're like, oh, I want to try those foods. Oh God, I'd love to see what Coca-Cola tastes like. And then that comes into your culture, and then suddenly you're excited to try it, and then it becomes normalized. And over time, you just get this kind of, these just homogenous cultures across the world, and they might have their own little differences, but what you see is that, like, it's the countries that are really quite stern in maintaining more of their traditions that actually are a bit more resistant to the increase in obesity. At least it seems. Obviously, it relates to economic things as well. But Japan is a good example of a country that still has very low obesity rates overall. They did change, I think, their classification of what was obesity to a BMI of 25, which would put the vast majority of Irish people in the category of obese. But that's because, as something I think we may have mentioned already, but Asian populations are typically more susceptible to metabolic complications at lower levels of obesity. So, you know, one of the downfalls of BMI classification across the board. But in Japan, I think, like, even with the 25 BMI, at least about 10 years ago anyway, it was their obesity rate was just like 20%, and that's like their overweight rate versus 65 or 68% or something in Ireland, which is a stark difference. But in Japan, they have maintained a lot of their dietary traditions in terms of the typical Japanese diet. You know, lots of rice, lots of vegetables with meals. They do consume a decent amount of meat as well. Typically, leaner meats that they're consuming. And they have a number of other traditions. Like I think they have basically this rule, if you will, or cultural norm, haribuchi, I think it's referred to as, but it's basically the concept of finishing your meal when you're 80% full, because it's seen to be gluttonous to stuff yourself with food. And, you know, we talk about weight stigma as being a problem here, but in Japan, there's a lot more weight stigma. Like they have, like, these are just examples of policies that you could potentially think about, but that I wouldn't agree with in our current environment. But there's examples where your test in private companies, even you have to have your waist measured on a yearly basis, and if your waist is going up, you have to go to dieting classes, and if you don't go, you get fined. And if companies have more than a certain amount of people who basically fail, who are overweight, then they receive fines as well. So there's a complete disincentive to even hiring people who are overweight. Good, bad, indifferent. I'm just sharing the other attitudes. I don't think that that's something you'd want to roll out here at all, but you just have to appreciate that there are significant cultural differences in different parts of the world. And Japan, I think, is probably one of the more extreme examples of countries that have, you know, tried to basically stop the spread of obesity or prevalence of obesity.
Yeah, it's really interesting again when you start like exposing yourself again outside of this like Anglosphere, because obviously we speak English. Like talking about like, you know, changes in or culture or whatever, like we're speaking English. Like the two of us are Irish, you know, like
Yeah.
again there's a reason that we're not speaking Irish, and that is the creep of, well, it was Cromwell, but anyway, it's because the creep of the influence of like Britain overall. Like if Irish people wanted to be successful in Ireland, you have to at least learn to speak English, you know. And then obviously, if you wanted to be successful in England, you have to, as an Irish person, you have to definitely know English. And the same again when you went to America. So like cultures do change, especially as populations move around. But again, like you said, with this like mass media like output, especially when it's like, you know, American movies, for example, like they go everywhere. So that American culture is basically being pushed out across the world. And this is actually why like say the Soviet Union, for example, like collapsed, you know, because they would get like, they'd see their neighbors like West Germany and East Germany, like classic example, they'd see their fucking neighbors across the fucking wall and they're wearing jeans, they're seeing their Americanized, like, you know, capitalism, like, oh, they're hyper prosperity and everything, and they're over there with fucking, you know, attack dogs going like, you're not allowed to look over there. Like, so like you could see how that appeal of something that you can't get heightens the appeal of that thing, but also you can see how it then spreads as well, you know. And this is again like you see it across the globe, like that's obviously just one example, but across the globe, and you see it with different cultural things and whatever else. But it also applies to food intake, and it basically gets people to move from a more traditional diet to a more, you know, SADS diet, like that standard American diet model. And you know, that's just not a health promoting diet model overall, you know. But just to kind of give a bit more clarity in terms of like how it happens, like the process is actually pretty straightforward. Again, like you think about this in England and America, for example, this has been happening over, let's give it 100 years, right? It's just been transitioning that way, right? But it really started accelerating in the last 50 years, right? But it's basically 100 years of refining the process, right? And now it's like you could see a change in a country in 5-10 years, you know. And the way it infiltrates is, and you'll see this in some of the more developing nations in like the emerging markets in Asia, right? Which I'm heavily invested in as well, because man, lots of money to be made in case anyone's looking. But basically the process is you bring in sugar sweetened beverages because they're easy to bring in, right? And it's the same with, like, we'll call it pre-packaged sugar sweetened beverages. I can't even fucking speak. Pre-packaged sugar confectionaries, right? Because again, they're easy to transport. You don't need a lot of shelf space to sell them. You don't need a lot of, you know, overall whatever in your shop to sell these things, right? So all of a sudden you start getting a load of like Coca-Colas, you know, Pepsis, Fantas, whatever drinks it is, right, that appeals to that market. And all you really need for them is like plug in your fridge and there you go, right? Easy to sell. People like the taste of them. Like people like the taste of them in Asia just as much as they like the taste of them in fucking, I don't know, Arizona. You know, it's like this, like there's like humans are humans, right? So then they start drinking more of them. So the business is like, yeah, man, I'm making loads of money off this Coca-Cola here or this Pepsi or whatever. Happy days. So I start bringing in more of it, right? So that's how it infiltrates the market. You're basically giving these individuals, these shop owners, an easy way to make money, right? And then it starts going in, like we were touching on, like McDonald's and stuff comes in. Like you might start getting these more multinational, transnational, whatever you want to call them, global companies like McDonald's coming in, or KFC, or you know whatever, coming in and going to these more affluent areas, right? But also think about that, right? If you are again someone from a lower socioeconomic status, and you know you just recently moved to the city, and the city has a McDonald's, and you've never even seen a McDonald's before because you grew up in like, you know, the countryside, you start associating that McDonald's with wealth. You know, you're like, this is what wealthy people do. They get a McDonald's, right? Because like you, from your class idea, you know, where you've grew up, like that was something that like you would just never get. Like you got literally fucking rice, potatoes, and fucking some meat if you were lucky, you know? It's like that's, you come over here and it's like, yeah, here's fries and a Big Mac, you know, you're like, this is fucking heaven, right? So you associate it with, you know, a better standard of living, right? So there's all the cultural context around that food as well, or that, you know, type of food, whatever. And so then you want more of it. You're gonna, oh, I'm gonna go to there 3-4 times per week, rather than a country that has had it, or an individual who's lived there their whole life. They're like, oh, McDonald's is, it's fine. You know, I don't really, you know, I've had it a few times, you know. Again, so you start seeing, as people populations move from the countryside to more urban areas, it's always going to increase because these items are seen as, you know, higher class items, right? And then effectively what that has overall is, again, you start moving more towards like prepackaged foods. You go into your shop, again, there's prepackaged foods there, right? And again, you look at foods that are easier to store. Like it's not like, oh, here's your carrot sticks, you know, they're prepackaged, they're going to stay, you know, good to go for, you know, what, 2 weeks or something, you know, versus here's your box of fucking cookies, you know. It's like, cool, these are going to fucking last for months. You know. So again, like you look at the shop owner, like they're more incentivized to sell something that they know they can put on a shelf and it's going to be good to go. They're not going to have to worry about, you know, a lot of stock rotation, a lot of, you know, making sure your items stay fresh, etc. And then also the consumer is not going to have to worry about that. They're just going to be able to go in and go, cool, I can buy this and it's going to be okay in my fucking press or my cupboard, as everyone else apart from the Irish say. It's going to be okay in my cupboard for forever, you know. So like, again, you can understand from both a psychological perspective of the consumer and of the individual selling it, this is a good thing. But again, like if we're looking at it from the overall company, this global transnational company's perspective that are selling this, like they're just really looking for profit, right? And again, I'm saying that as someone that is part of the problem, because I'm fucking invested in most of these companies, and I'm also invested in the S&P 500. So like I'm invested in all of these companies realistically. So that's, you know, I'm part of the problem. But that's how it happens, right? And that leads overall to a decrease, or say generally an increase in fat intake in the diet, a decrease in the historical, cultural, ancestral diet pattern overall, and a move away from foods that, you know, these people have generally survived on for however many years, you know. And again, like you said, like Japan is a bit of a different case, but the Japanese economy is also a different case. Like they always say, like there's basically 4 different types of economies, and like they only ever single out 2 countries as being fucking weird economies, and that's Japan and Argentina. But Japan is basically a weird economy, right? So it acts differently, right? So it's kind of, you want to just not focus on that too much, and you have to look at all the other ones that are not the outliers, you know. So like that's the process that happens. Sugar sweetened beverages come in, or sugar sweetened or sugar confectionery and stuff comes in, easy to sell, makes sense from the consumer's perspective, and from the seller's perspective, makes sense to sell it, right? Then you have something like a McDonald's moving in, and again, they go to the urban areas, so there's this kind of class idea going on in terms of, oh, this is what the higher classes do. And then you have this change, this overall transition away from this traditional diet to a more, standard American diet overall. And that's coupled with generally a decrease in activity as you get a more urban population and you move away from more agricultural based jobs or even factory jobs or anything like that. It's like, oh no, I work at a desk for 8 hours per day, sitting down, right? So that's how it happens. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No, I guess the only thing is that like people might have listened to everything so far and they still turn around and think, well, it's just a trade-off and we should just accept it as a trade-off because if people want to be unhealthy, that's their choice. Whereas it's certainly not that simple. And I think that, from a public health perspective, there are many, even if you don't care about other people, there are other effects of increasing obesity prevalence and increased non-communicable disease that come back to affect you potentially or affect your country. The US has even, I think we mentioned that they declared it a national security issue because of the prevalence of obesity. The well-esteemed capitalist Vladimir Lenin once said that he once said that the health of the worker was the most important thing. And the reason he said that was not necessarily because he was a virtuous individual, but because he said that we need to maintain their productivity. And that is actually something that it does need to be considered too. If you do just have a increasing obesity throughout the population, you let that just run completely awry and people are becoming sicker earlier and everything, that burdens the healthcare system and leads to reduced productivity as well. So there's other things beyond just how it affects the individual themselves. So I think it's
on that. There's literally no way that the obesity epidemic doesn't affect everyone, right? And this again, it comes back to the healthcare thing, which we'll touch on a few different points on that in a second. But like you have to pay for it regardless, and I mean everyone has to pay for it regardless. Because again, if your healthcare system is overburdened, like that means that you don't have as good of access to healthcare if you do need it, right? Because there's more people using it because more people are sick because of these non-communicable diseases, right? But also, if you have socialized medicine in any way, shape, or form, which a lot of countries do in this day and age, like you're paying for it, right? But even if you don't have socialized medicine, right, you have more of an American model of medical care, you're paying for it in your insurance, right? Like they've already taken that into account that whatever 60, 70% of the population are obese or overweight, and they're like, this is the rate of these different diseases, these non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes, whatever. And they're like, these are the amount of payouts we're going to have to pay out as a result. So we have to make our money as an insurance company. I'm going to charge more. So you get higher costs. Even if you are like, oh, I just make my own choices, like you still end up having to pay more as a result, And again, like you might be the best person, whatever, but you still end up having to deal with the consequences of this,
Yeah, so like fundamentally, like public health is in everyone's interest, really. Having a healthier population is a pretty good thing. So we can agree on that. Very good.
Just on the healthcare stuff as well. Like obviously, I'm just looking at it from that perspective, and I'm just saying that, but I do also acknowledge, and if people know my actual politics, I do actually care about the health of society overall, not just like the actual health. I mean, like the overall healthiness of the society itself. And it makes sense to not have sick people in that society, that aren't able to contribute to society or, are looked down upon in society. Like if we start treating them differently in society, like that's also not good. And like we want to have ideally a cohesive society that everyone is healthy and happy. Like I think that should be the goal. But just on that as well, it's actually interesting, and we kind of said it at the start of the podcast, I believe. But there is a situation which, again, if you look at the Anglosphere, like America, England, and like Australia and whatever else, they basically have a society that built up really good healthcare systems over the last 100 years, however long, right? And unfortunately, they don't have that in a lot of these more developing countries. And as a result of that, like you have this increase in non-communicable diseases as a result of obesity. But if you're doing it in, say, China, like you have an increased prevalence of obesity in China or Africa or something, like obviously Africa is an entire continent, not a country like China, but in various places in Africa, like you can effectively have a healthcare system that's not set up to be able to deal with these situations. Like, even though, like, we would say like the West has like the best healthcare system in the world, especially if you look at like the Nordic countries, they'd be like, oh, they have the best healthcare system. Like, they still struggle to deal with the obesity epidemic, you know? So if you're going like, oh, the top tier healthcare systems struggle with this, like, how do you expect the bottom? Like, how do you expect these countries that are just developing their healthcare system to deal with it? You know, so again, it increases the overall burden on society, regardless. And again, that directly impacts you if you believe it's like, oh, it's all just individualism, and you know, look after yourself, and you know, make sure you're healthy and everything. Like, it kind of, you're biting your nose off to spite your face. You know, it's like this. It is going to directly impact you. Right now, maybe not, because you're like, oh, it's fine, but it will at some stage, or at least it can at some stage.
Yeah, and that actually is like a really important and I think underappreciated point, is the fact that like it's not the same to have this nutrition transition and increasing obesity prevalence happen in a developing nation versus a developed nation, if you will. It's just not the same, and it has much more adverse effects. Because like if you ever get the time, like look up the prices of some like newer drugs, like drugs that are still patented that are seem to be effective. Like, because one of the things people get quite excited about, like if you're into it, is like there's a lot of developments going on in, for example, the prevention of heart disease that are quite promising, whether it be related to interventional cardiology, or it might be related to PCSK9 inhibitors, for example, like really effective drugs for reducing LDL cholesterol and atherosclerosis, etc., which are obesity related complications as well. And that's all really exciting, but look up the price of PCSK9 inhibitors and see how that's going to translate over to low middle income countries. Like it's just not, you know. And these are the types of things that you have to wrestle with, because like one of the good things about like vaccinations, for example, when it comes to infectious diseases, is like they're actually like not that expensive. Like, yeah, obviously there's a lot of money that goes into it, but in terms of if you're Bill Gates or some sort of philanthropist and you want to donate to a program to combat disease in an African country, for example, you know that if you can effectively get a vaccination program out, that this is going to be super effective at eradicating disease. That's not the case for non-communicable disease, for heart disease, diabetes, etc. There's no simple solution that a philanthropist billionaire can say, oh yeah, here, I'm going to give 5 billion to that, because there's basically no effective solutions that are easy to donate to and roll out. So there's lots of complications that go quite far. But anyway, that's not the purpose of today, but they are some of the challenges to keep in your mind for sure.
Just on that as well, it's actually really interesting when you start thinking on a more global scale, because especially with drugs and the whole drug system, like in say Europe, for example, like that's obviously where we're both from, and like we have this perspective of like, oh geez, I'd hate to live in America, like their drug system, you know, it's awful. But you have to remember then that the case with that is like, first of all, the majority of the drugs that are made in terms of like the patents and stuff, they're held by American companies. Well, a kind of Israeli and American companies, they're the two places that, you know, make all the drugs or come up with all the drugs, right? But they basically recoup all of their research and development from the American market, right? And that means, as a result, that we all, if you live in a European country, Middle Eastern, fucking Asian, African, we all have a vested interest in the American system not changing, right? Because if the American system was to change, we would all have to pay more for the drugs, right? They can't just recoup their losses in America anymore. They have to recoup their losses, like their research and development losses, all over the world, right? So we have a vested interest in America not doing well with the cost of their drugs, whether you like to admit it or not, right? And it's also the same with the army, you know, like if like America always gives out, well, like say Donald Trump, for example, always gives out about like other countries not paying their NATO budget, like not actually contributing the amount that they're supposed to their own defense. You know, like say, for example, they single out Germany, for example, they're not paying their whatever 2 or 3% for their military budget. Like they're able to pay that money elsewhere because they don't have to defend themselves, because America will defend themselves, you know, because America has a vested interest in all these Middle Eastern countries, has a vested interest in having, you know, army bases in Germany, etc. Right? So again, we've outsourced all that protection, and you might disagree with American imperialism, American interventionism, whatever, but you are protected because of that. You know, like it was like in like with all the Brexit talk in Ireland, like people were like, oh, like Ireland aren't going to let Britain fly their planes over Ireland, you know? And like, if you actually think of it, like that has to be the stupidest thing anyone could possibly say, because it's the RAF that protects the Irish airs, you know? Like, what do you think? Like, British planes are going to be shot out of the sky by British aircraft, like military aircraft? Like, clearly not, you know? So, like, the world itself is a lot more interconnected than you actually think, right? And like this stuff really brings it to the fore in terms of when we're talking about like a globalized food system and stuff, and how that affects like obesity rates and everything. But also, again, like you have to think of it more so just from your own side of things as well as an individual. How, yeah, okay, you can have an individual perspective on a lot of this stuff, but you can only have that perspective in a well-functioning society. Like we touched on in the last podcast, like you could have this very laissez-faire ideology and go like, oh, we should have no regulations and no whatever. And that's all great and well. But as I will always say to that statement, right? Like I have what, fucking a load of brothers, right? I know people that have, 12 kids in their family, all boys, right? All men, right? Do you genuinely think that that's not going to lead, like a laissez-faire system, that's not going to lead to a system where I'm just going to pair up with this other family that have a load of boys, and the two of us with our fucking army of like 25 lads are not just going to take whatever the fuck we want, you know? Because that's the way it's going to happen in a laissez-faire system. That's the way it has always happened. It's not going to be like, oh, all the roads still get looked after and all the like, fire brigade will come around and everything. Like, no, that stuff doesn't happen. It descends into anarchy because people like me that have resources and just like inborn resources, like all my brothers would say, for example, like over 6 foot, it's like this, you're not going to be able to compete with that unless you were just born with these resources, like you're born into a household that has it. So like it's not a better system, and as a result you should just get that system out of your mind and stop thinking on a purely individualistic perspective. And look, I'm a real big fan of like rugged individualism. Like me as an individual, like I just want to fucking live in a cabin in the fucking woods up a mountain and be left the fuck alone, right? Like that's all I want, right? But even then I'm like, I still want to interact with people. I still want to have a functioning society all around me. I don't want to wake up every single morning and go, shit, man, has the apocalypse happened? Has like, is society fucking being ravaged, So even if you are as ruggedly individual as you can possibly be, like you still want to be able to go into the local fucking town occasionally and go, here, look, I actually think I have appendicitis, like you still want to be able to be looked after, and as a result you need to have a functioning society.
Yeah, and to take that point on to kind of the next part of our discussion, like some of you might be thinking at this point, particularly if you're someone that like ourselves, like we're big fans of the rugged individualism perspective. Like I think you can still appreciate that while being very much pro public health. Like sometimes you can find yourself thinking, oh, not me though, doesn't affect me. All that marketing, all that cheap food doesn't affect me at all. But it does. Like realistically, it does in some way. It does affect you. You're not totally immune to it, and it's definitely not realistic to expect everyone else to be immune to it. Like personally, I have observed an example of this in myself recently, because I just moved in the last 2 weeks. Well, I've been here about a week and a half, but basically I moved further away from my local boo gym. And normally what I do is sometimes, like maybe between 1 and 3 times a week, depending on the week, what I might do if I'm really busy with work or I'm studying or something, or I just want to treat myself, I'll order myself a little burrito on the Deliveroo app. Okay. But now I'm outside the catchment area for Deliveroo, and I haven't had Boojum in 2 weeks. I'm unfortunately, with regret. But in that case, like that's just because the service no longer operates for me. It's no longer available and I can't eat that food. So as a result, that changes the structure of my diet, which is purely the result of the availability of the market. So obviously this still affects someone like myself, even though I'm someone who can manage my diet quite well. And with that said, like I generally get something pretty healthy in Boojum, and I still manage my diet. But it's just an example of how these things do actually impact your life. And you can see these things in your own life as well, where, you know, if a new coffee shop opens in your office building, for example, and, you know, they're giving away free muffins, like, are you likely to take the free muffin? Of course you are. You know, the vast majority of the people are going to take the muffin. The vast majority of the people are going to go to the coffee shop, even though they mightn't have previously when it wasn't there. Even if it was just 5 or 10 minute walk away versus being in the building, all of that stuff impacts your behavior. So whether or not you like it, all of these things are affecting you. That includes things like social media. Everyone appreciates how much the, you know, that slot machine on your phone impacts your behavior. And the food system is the exact same, because fundamentally social media companies are trying to grab your attention and commoditize it, and food companies are effectively just trying to grab your appetite, you know, and try to get you to eat, and not necessarily as much of their food, but continue purchasing as much food worth of value from their company. So it's ultimately in all of our interests to have a think about how much we want that to impact our everyday lives, because you can absolutely be in favor of having plenty of food options without it necessarily being the case that when you walk into Centra, for example, that you're immediately faced with all of the nicest foods immediately with 100 different options, and then you go to pay, and then the shopkeeper or whatever, they say, oh look, we've got these 2-for-1 dairy milk bars, you sure you don't want them now? All those things impact your behavior. So, you know, there's a nice middle ground there somewhere. We don't want to just ban processed foods either.
Yeah, and there's so much to this that we could discuss, and like there's actually like loads of documentaries on this stuff as well, that if you are interested, like even on like Netflix and stuff, I think there's a good few. Like obviously some of them are fucking shit on Netflix, like What the Health and all, but they do give an idea of like the overall changing food system. Like a good one is actually Super Size Me 2. I know a lot of people saw Super Size Me, like the first one where he just basically ate a load of McDonald's. But Super Size Me 2 really does dive a little bit deeper into the overall food system as a whole. And you can see how it's changed from the consumer perspective, but also from like the farmer perspective, for example, or like these multinational corporations perspective as well. So that's a good movie. That's a good recommendation if you're looking. But yeah, so look, realistically, everything has changed. The game has changed, right? And how do we fix this? Like, I don't fucking know. Look, realistically, I'm not that fucking smart. Look, I'm quite dumb, realistically, in the grand scheme of things. So I don't know how to fix this, right? I can see that there's effectively 3 situations that we have as potential solutions. We have less regulation, right? And some people would argue for that. We have more regulation, and then we have more consumer responsibility. Those are the 3 solutions we have to this whole situation that I can see, right? The less regulation, like I don't really see how you could put that forth as a solution, you know? Like I don't think freeing the market more is going to make it a better market in terms of, you know, what the practices are, right? And I should just say on that, like realistically as well, we don't have a free market. Like we still have like grain subsidies, for example. We have, you know, loads of subsidies for farmers, which, you know, I'm all for, because like I think farmers, you know, don't get the fucking profit that they deserve. And even with all these subsidies, like they still are only hanging on by a fucking thread. In a lot of cases anyway. And like I don't think that necessarily is bad, but that as a result of having those subsidies, we don't have a free market, you know? So like if we're going to have less regulation at the end point where the consumer is involved, then we have to have less intervention at the upstream thing, which would inherently mean that we have less food available in the overall system, because these farmers would basically not be able to exist, you know? So like I don't think that's a good thing. Like basically inducing famine. I don't know how you could make that argument for that being better, right? The next thing then is obviously like, you know, less regulation, or sorry, more regulation. Like, is that the way forward? And like, this is something that we kind of touched on the last episode as well, in terms of like, this is a very like anti-Hayekian fucking framework, right? And Hayek was like, "Oh, look, the government should interfere less, and they should not be involved. Basically, like free up the shackles of the market, right?" And like, I don't necessarily agree with that entirely. However, we do have to heed that with a pinch of salt, and realize that there is a good fundamental idea behind that, in terms of like, how do we avoid the solution having unintended consequences that disrupt the market overall, right? Because like, a central planner is not going to be as good as all of us planning the market ourselves. Now the market can manipulate us as much as we manipulate the market, but like, we do have to be aware of government intervention being done incorrectly. For example, you could bring in more tax on certain foods, but that ends up being a tax on the poor, right? Like, that's obviously not what we want. We don't want these already marginalized people in society that are facing significant health risks to be taxed more, right? Like, it's not beneficial, right? Now it does work in certain circumstances, in terms of like the tax on alcohol, the tax on cigarettes and stuff in Ireland, at least. Like, I think it's like 90% of the money you pay for alcohol in Ireland is tax. So like, we still have a drinking problem in Ireland. So like, it's not necessarily effective to do that. And again, you think about who is that actually disproportionately affecting, it's probably like lower class people. Although, well, yeah, it is, because even if you talk about like the differences in terms of alcohol consumption, like, that's not really the metric we should be looking at. It's like the amount of money spent on alcohol consumption versus the amount of money you actually earn. So if you're earning like fucking, I don't know, 50K a month, like you buying a couple of bottles of wine, you don't care that it's 90% tax, versus you earning like fucking €200 a week, and you're paying 90% tax on this fucking 12 pack or whatever. It's like, it's obviously a fucking difference. So we have to be aware of that, right? And like, we have to be aware that we effectively don't want to make quote unquote good food less affordable for anyone, really. And we could say that you could bring in something like a sugar tax, which we'll touch on in a second, because Britain actually brought in a sugar tax, which I think was actually relatively well thought out. But anyway, and then also, I think, like, how do we not lose jobs with the solution, right? When we're thinking about government intervention, like, you don't want to lose like farming jobs or food service working jobs, like, unless you have a place for those individuals to go. Like, it's hard to think of a situation or a solution to the problem. Like, you can only have, I don't know, fucking 4 fast food restaurants in this fucking, I don't know, 10-kilometer radius or whatever, right? And all of a sudden you just lost 1,000 jobs from all the other fast food restaurants that had to close down. And like, that's obviously not beneficial. And then you have 1,000 people unemployed with no jobs to go to, So again, like, we have to think those things through before we just make these broad sweeping interventions, right? And again, as I said, like, I'm not fucking smart enough to make these interventions. I'm just going, look, let's be a little bit fucking, on the ball when we're thinking about this stuff, right? So like, we have to be aware of the more regulation thing, and like, it's a fucking hard one. Like, I'm not going to say I have a solution, right? Now, we obviously believe in the other one as well. Like, I think there's multiple levels we can intervene here, and like, I think a more educated and empowered consumer is ultimately the best option, right? However, like, people have real lives, and are unfortunately easily manipulated by subversive forces, and by that I mean like marketing. So like, while I like to think that a more educated and empowered society is going to be a great fucking thing for society overall, like, we're still basically just fucking hairless monkeys. Like, you put a Coca-Cola on the screen and give it that, and you have it like, cool water dripping down the edge of it, and it's warm out. You're gonna be like, actually, yeah, I wouldn't mind a nice, like, fizzy drink there. Let's go down to the shops and get one. So like, we're all just fucking monkeys, right? Like, you're at the fucking whim of your little monkey brain. But yeah, like, other than that, like, I don't really know what the solution is to the issue, right? You have anything to say on that, Gary?
Yeah, I think, like, ultimately it does end up being like a very difficult conversation to have, because you kind of do get into like ethical discussions, really, and you have to obviously have the discussion from a political philosophy perspective of like, what do you want government to do? What's the role of government? And that's actually a difficult conversation, because in order to accept that, for example, taxation on, or high levels of taxation on processed foods, or foods with more fat plus sugar per food or something like that, or whatever it happens to be, then you basically put the power in government to decide what people should eat, and to facilitate that through specific behavioral interventions. And some people will say, oh, but that's manipulating, that's making people eat by disincentivizing this and that. And like, all these things are just various levels of intervention on the public health ladder. There's some that are less intervention.
Just on that as well, it's actually really interesting when you think about this just a little bit deeper, because like people will say those things but then advocate those things in other areas. Like people will say like, oh, if you put this tax on this food, for example, like that's going to disproportionately affect like lower income people, right? They'll be like, oh, you can't put a 60% tax on this food, right, to disincentivize it. But then they'll turn around and say, oh yes, the rich should pay a 60% tax on their income. And you're like, are you not, does that not just disincentivize them to work then? It's like, you have to, when you're trying to deal with this, and I'm trying to come from this from a genuine place, like you have to deal with your own deeply embedded beliefs in terms of like, how you think society should be run. Because if you think something should be done in this area, but then you don't think basically the exact same thing, like it's carrot and stick, it's like, okay, you're saying we should use the stick here, but use the carrot here. Like, why is that? And if you believe this is a disincentive and it's not a disincentive in this area in terms of like, again, bringing a 60% tax on a certain food, and then saying we should tax people at 60%, you have to confront that stuff. And again, this is why people don't want to dig deeper with this stuff, because it is a very hard, introspective thing that you have to do.
Yeah, because I think part of it as well that's quite difficult for people to acknowledge is the fact that in order to accept a given level of government intervention, you also have to kind of accept that about yourself, that your behaviors are not necessarily governed by you, that you're not 100% solely just this individual that makes everything very rationally. And I think acknowledging that is really, really important. And I think, again, it does come down to like stratifying this into different populations as well. Because, for example, I would definitely be in favor of more aggressive intervention when it comes to pediatric populations, children. Like if your prefrontal cortex isn't developed until you're like 25 or something, then from my perspective, you're not able to make the most rational, high functioning decisions until you're around that age. So,
Oh, you shouldn't be allowed to vote, is what you're saying.
yeah, it's my first year voting. but like when you're a child, for example, like we know that marketing directly to children from fast food companies and other food companies, that impacts their behavior, their desire for foods, etc. So like I would be more in favor of like limiting and restricting marketing to children, and things like, for example, specific school programs, things like the regulation of menus in schools, for example. Like I remember in my secondary school, like some of the lads used to just get like lunch every day in school, and they used to have like, these like potato balls, and they used to have chicken nuggets and stuff. They eventually changed the menu, but initially it was like that. And like, it's just awful to have that stuff in schools, because as soon as the menu changed, yeah, like guys bought different stuff. But obviously you can just go to the shop as well and buy whatever. But these types of things do impact behavior. So definitely, like in children in particular, I'm definitely more in favor of those types of interventions. I think most people would be. Like, I think it's fair enough to accept that we should look after those more vulnerable in society. I think where people have more challenge or more difficulty accepting more aggressive interventions, such as taxation or other disincentives to buy particular foods, or incentives to buy other foods, or restrictions on marketing, etc., is in adults. Because some of us like to think that, oh, we're all responsible for ourselves, and if you can't make your own decisions, that's your fault. But again, the susceptibility to marketing, the susceptibility to needing to save money on certain foods, etc., the availability of foods, whether it be a food desert or a food swamp, which we've discussed earlier in the obesity series, all these things go on to impact one's food choices. And we've already seen, like, if you were looking at this in any other area of research, you'd accept that, okay, like this experiment clearly demonstrates that this food environment results in increasing rates of obesity. We can't necessarily, like, it's unrealistic to expect that somehow all of the individuals who are going to change their behavior without there being a change in the causal factor that led to them adopting the behavior in the first place. So yeah, I think like right wing, left wing, up down doesn't matter. I think that you can still have these objective discussions and realize that there is a lot of challenge here, and that I don't think it's actually easy to come to these conclusions either, because I think that when it comes to the regulation of food and stuff, and discussing obesity and obesity policy, you don't actually tend to find, like sometimes you do, but I don't find that there's like a hard like left wing versus right wing stance as there is on other topics. Like I think a lot of people just kind of have these ideas that they've never really had to think about deeply, and thinking about them for me, and I'm sure for you, has definitely caused me to question a lot of my own biases as well.
I don't have any biases, Gary.
I'm a robot.
But yeah, look, it's a fucking complex thing.
Yep.
I'm just gonna fucking end it on basically leaving with a few questions, right? So like, obviously, like we've thought about this stuff and we're coming to the conclusion that we don't have a good conclusion. But there are obviously smarter people out there, and maybe one of you is actually listening to this. So if you think you have a solution to this from a policy perspective, because obviously we have a solution from an individual perspective, right? And we'll talk about that in future episodes in terms of like what you should do if you want to, you know, fix your overweight or obesity, right? If you want to, like, you know, become normative weight, right? Like we can talk about that for fucking days till the cows come home. There's so many interventions we could do on an individual level, right? But if we're talking about a policy level, like a society-wide level, a government-wide level, like it's not like you have to even just focus on the culture, not necessarily just the policies that are affected or affecting nutrition, the nutritional landscape, right? Like again, like we were talking about like Japan and stuff, you know, like there's a lot of cultural stuff that goes on in the background that allows certain interventions to be successful versus not be successful, you know? So if you have a policy that you're thinking, oh, we should do this, like just think about what would that actually look like in terms of for you as the individual, right? So you're an obese individual in a lower socioeconomic status, for example. What would these interventions look like? Okay, so we put a tax on certain foods. Does that mean that you have less access to foods? Is that actually making your life harder in the short term, and that you're okay with that because it makes it better in the long term? You have to just think about that, you know, with the intervention you want to bring in, right? Like, are you ending up with less food in your belly as a result, right? So if you are a marginalized person in society, is that necessarily a good thing, right? And if we have too heavy a hand, do we effectively end the prosperity that we have been experiencing? Like we've basically eradicated starvation, you know, fucking around the world, you know? And it is because of these neoliberal policies and this more globalized system that we have, you know? So again, I always view it as an absolute win for capitalism or neoliberalism. I'm like, it's too effective, right? That's the way you should view it. Just be like, I'm not going to say it's bad. I'm just going to say that it's too effective for, you know, humanity at this time. And again, I view it like horse racing, you know, so this horse that is neoliberalism in the food environment needs to be handicapped, right? So in horses, you just put more weight on them so, you know, they can't run as fast, right? So here it's like, okay, we need to have some level of intervention so that the obesity epidemic isn't running as fast, right? So people can still have their choice, they can still have their freedom, but there's barriers to that, right? So you have to think about that. And again, like there are individual level policies that we can bring in that I think are effective, you know, like putting health labels, for example, on foods. And like, if you do care about your health or something, like you can look at it, like putting like nutrition data on your food, like they're great interventions to do. Now, is that going to solve the obesity epidemic overall? No, but it lets the individual make better choices themselves, right? But again, I don't think that's the be all and end all, right? And then you can start thinking of like, oh, different incentives and different disincentives at different levels in the overall food environment. And like you can talk about like grants and taxation on the consumer, and then at the corporate level, like how are we fixing this? Like, are we helping farmers to make cheaper food? You know, because again, I would advocate for that because I think it creates more jobs. Like, again, I think like I would also advocate, even though I'm definitely like, it's definitely an antagonistic belief to my overall beliefs. Like I would be very right leaning. I don't think that like nationalizing industries is a great idea for a lot of things, but I would also be like, why don't we just nationalize like a chemical industry in terms of like fertilizer, for example? Like no Irish farmer, I can tell you right now, no Irish farmer likes being beholden to German fucking fertilizing companies and chemical companies, you know? Whereas if we had an Irish one, like, I don't know, subsidiary of fucking Board Bia or something, and they were able to get cheap fertilizer and as a result produce better crops and, you know, whatever, like basically in Ireland we grow grass, but, you know, they were able to do that at a much cheaper rate. Like they're able to make cheaper food. And again, you could then regulate that overall. So it's like, okay, we're able to make cheaper food in certain ways that we want. Like maybe you give them a grant for, you know, growing vegetables. Like we basically don't grow vegetables in Ireland, you know, and like we get them from fucking the middle of Europe, right? So again, like maybe you want to change that. Now, Ireland doesn't have a great climate for that, so maybe not that. But I'm just saying, like, these are kind of ideas that you need to be thinking through. Like, how can you both create jobs, because you would create jobs with the chemical plant there, and then you would also help these farmers who are already struggling with cheaper fertilizer, and then we could make cheaper food. So even though we're going to heavily regulate, you know, whatever these prepackaged foods, these fast foods, whatever, we're also making it cheaper to get healthier foods, right? So again, like you can think of stuff like that, and I'm just saying, like that's me spitballing here. Like I haven't thought that out. Like there could be fucking huge gaps in that, but you know what I mean. Like we could be thinking of these different things, at different levels of the overall food system, right? Like again, like how do we incentivize like national produce or national produce, like foods that are made here versus like this multinational corporation, you know? Like I think a heavy tax on advertising of certain kinds, it makes sense, you know? Like I don't see why it wouldn't make sense. I also don't see why, like I know we've had this whole thing about like essential workers and, you know, whatever in the last while. Like I don't know how anyone could make an argument that, I don't know, RTE, for example, is an essential work. Like maybe the news, but they should just be on a blank screen for the rest of the time. You know, if we're all not allowed work, why should they be allowed work? You know, like again, if they're essential workers or they're non-essential workers, like how is advertising essential work? You know? So again, I think there should definitely be a heavy tax on advertising, especially like you said, to the youth. You know, if you're advertising Happy Meals with, you know, toys in those Happy Meals to younger individuals, I'm like, that's quite fucking like reckless in my mind. And as I said in the last podcast, I think anyway, I've said it a few times. Like I don't like, I'm very pessimistic with the overall approach. I'm like, I'll help individuals on an individual level, but I don't know how we fix it in a policy level now. I know how we could potentially fix it in the future by impacting change in the youth right now, but I don't know how we fix it right now. Like I think some individuals are kind of too far gone on a society-wide scale. Like again, they could be helped on an individual scale, but that means they have to want to change, which, you know, nobody wants to change. Like nobody wants to change their lives. So I don't know. I think intervening at the childhood stage is the way forward. And again, I think as a society, if we look after children, look after their nutrition, like we end up with a better society overall. And I think that's like fairly well, you know, backed up by the science in terms of we know developmentally what that does in terms of having good nutrition, good access to, you know, a variety of quote unquote healthy food at a younger age. Like it just makes smarter people, it makes healthier people overall. So that's only a benefit, a win for society, you know? And again, in doing that, you would create more jobs, which is what I care about the most, because again, it gives meaning and purpose to people's lives. Like you literally have jobs in the food service industry. So maybe you fucking get rid of these, I don't know, McDonald's workers in their food service industry, but you then hire them in the nationalized fucking food bank thing where, you know, we feed all the kids, you know, every school gets free lunch or whatever the fuck, you know, like there's different ways that you could go about it and still keep jobs and still keep a functioning society and then end up in 10-20 years with a better society, you know. But again, like there's probably huge holes in my thinking. Like I'm not saying I have this whole thought true. If I did, like I wouldn't be talking on this. I would have a document that I'd be submitting to the government. But yeah, and then like also we can do stuff like incentivizing building of local supermarkets and exercise facilities, especially in low income areas, but just across the board, you know, like I don't see why, and like maybe I'm biased because obviously this is the industry we're in. Like why don't gyms get a fucking fat grant, you know? Like every time you want to build a gym, like why isn't there like, oh here, like you don't pay tax for the next 10 years in terms of VAT, you know? Like the lottery gives money to, I don't know, sports clubs. Like they'll give money to the GAA, they'll give money to like boxing clubs and whatever else. Like why isn't it given to gyms like that? Surely, if we're trying to incentivize people to exercise, that makes sense. So like stuff like that, I'm like, I think it's an easy win that could be easily done, right? And then there is also like a concept called nudging, which we'll probably talk about in like future episodes. But like there are different interventions that we can do that are beneficial. But again, we just have to be aware that first of all, we don't want to give government too much power because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But also like central planning has rarely worked out in the past in terms of like an individual can't know all of the different unintended consequences of their actions. Like again, like the classic example, I think it was Mao Zedong that was like, oh, all of those sparrows are eating the grain when we throw it out to plant our crops. So let's kill all the sparrows. So they literally incentivize killing of all the sparrows, right? And you think, okay, cool. Now we have better grain crop because more of the grain then became, crops, or more of the seeds became crops. But all that happened then was because the sparrows were all killed, fucking locusts then descended and they had another famine. So like it's not just like, oh, there was this little small unintended consequence, like it wasn't too bad. It's like, no, we could make a mistake with this stuff and end up with famine. So we have to tread lightly. It's not just like we can bring in this sweeping change. Like it has to be like gently done, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like ultimately, I think that there are many different potential avenues for intervention. And to be honest, like even small interventions are very difficult to enact. And that's why us sitting here, like going back and forth, is just not that influential. Like hopefully it's influential insofar as you're a personal trainer or you're a trainee and you discuss these things with your family and your friends, and that if there's policy to vote on in the future, you allow or you share your views with your vote. But in terms of like actually enacting these things, even as simple as a sugar tax, which would seem like quite a small intervention, the goal being obviously that if it's more expensive, that like there's two elements to it. One, people will buy less, but then the company ultimately reformulates their product with lower sugar. So that's one of the things that people often don't get about taxation. It's not just a case of trying to get people to not buy the product. It's also saying to the company, here, if you want to reformulate your product and have it cheaper, you need to follow these rules. Essentially, again, there's trade-offs there too, but even in trying to enact that, there you have lobbying from companies at government level to make it more challenging. And this just came up recently with one of the professors of public health in UCC who was lecturing us, and I was actually discussing this topic as it relates to like media framing and that sort of thing, because one thing that happened, for example, in 2013 when Mayor Bloomberg tried to introduce the that was the limit on the max size of the soda, for example, soft drinks. Basically what happened was, if you look at the media and you actually look at the studies examining media framing of the topic, like a lot of it, I think like 60 or 70% was negative framing in the media. It wasn't necessarily from public health professionals. It was people from companies who were Coca-Cola, etc., coming on to discuss it and talking about it from a negative perspective. And then the media perspective, although Paddy's decided RTE are being shut down, so it doesn't matter here. But basically, like from the media perspective, that's then influencing the public conversation. And even if it doesn't influence them directly, it introduces that argument into the person's mind that they can then discuss with other people. So like this stuff does run deep, and you can imagine that if you're trying to introduce a sugar tax, and that's what that professor was saying. He was saying he brought up this topic of like how sugar taxation works, the UK example, etc., at a meeting with where these representatives from different companies were, and he had huge pushback. They don't want it to go forward, pushing back against it, etc. And like that's just one of the difficult things, is that ultimately, when it comes to these complex decision-making processes and government and designing, if you will, a society, etc., it's really difficult because there's different interests. A company cares about their bottom line. That's what they care about, and ultimately, different companies are working with different values in mind, and trying to satisfy everyone just doesn't really work. So I think that we have to be clear on our values as a society as well, which is again not going to be achieved on this podcast.
Yeah, and just even with the sugar tax, like you should broaden your horizon when you're thinking about this stuff, because there are multiple ways you can achieve the same outcome, and people get caught up in thinking of one way. For example, like if you are a business, like you were saying here, like they don't want to have to get a tax on their product, right? Because that means that they have to then reformulate, right? And they have to potentially get a reduction in their overall profit margin, but also just their sales in general, right? But like you can actually incentivize a company to change. Like you could say to a company, I'm going to charge you, or in Ireland we have 23% VAT on every product, right? So you could say to them like, oh, we're going to lower your VAT down to 10% if you achieve this, this, and this target in terms of like sugar in your beverage and whatever else, right? Like that fixes both the problem. The companies then like, okay, cool, I can actually still make fucking money, right? Because everyone wants money, and I'm incentivized to change the formulation, which is ultimately what the government is trying to do with a sugar tax, right? So like there are other ways around it. Now, again, there's probably some key issues with that. Like again, like that means that the government has less tax overall, and it's probably, you know, I don't know about the overall tax law in different countries and stuff, but like maybe they're not allowed to give specific tax incentives to different companies, you know, because that then causes one company to be, you know, better off than another company that doesn't get that tax break, you know? So like there are ways to tackle something from different perspectives, but again, like we have to think of it in terms of incentives and disincentives. If we can incentivize these companies to do better, then that's a win for society, right? And how we actually achieve that, like it's less relevant, is less important to me how we actually achieve that, as long as we actually get the end goal that we're looking for, right? That in my mind, I'm like, as long as we can keep jobs, as long as we can, you know, get the end goal, like the end kind of justifies the means, like obviously within, you know, an ethical framework. I'm not going to be saying like, oh, introduce slavery and stuff, like because it, you know, cheapens the fucking produce and stuff. Like obviously that's not beneficial, but you know what I'm saying in terms of like there's multiple ways we can attack this singular outcome that we want to achieve that would benefit both parties in terms of like the consumer and the end, or and the producer as well, right? So again, I don't have all the answers. I definitely do not have all the answers. However, someone listening to this might have all the answers and might be able to impact change at some level. And, you know, hopefully, like Gary said, like if you do eventually have a situation where you're able to impact on, you know, giving your vote, giving your opinion on something, like you would take a more nuanced perspective of this, which I've hopefully tried to do throughout this, even though, as I said from the last podcast and in this podcast, like I'm obviously biased, like I'm invested in these companies. So like their bottom line, like I'm invested in them making more money and paying me a fat dividend and also growing their company, you know, like that's what I want. Right now, again, that's an ethical, you know, thing that I have to deal with because I also don't like what happens to society as a result, you know. So it's a bigger discussion than just like how do we solve the obesity epidemic and why capitalism is to blame. You know, it's a far larger discussion, and like again, like we said earlier on, it involves a lot of like introspection and actually looking at your own beliefs and seeing how accurate they are in terms of their effect on what you actually want to impact on, and then also in terms of your biases and blind spots in different areas. Like, why do you believe something here, but then believe the exact opposite over here? And again, that's perfectly fine to do. You know, like you might think that that's actually not okay. Like you can't have conflicting beliefs, but you definitely can. You can be like, there's a nuance to this stuff, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, like investments aside, like even thinking about an individual level, like both you and I, like if we were on holidays or something, like or even we were like going to get food in Dublin somewhere, like I want the best options possible. I want there to be 3,000 calories pizzas available to me, but I recognize that that's not necessarily what I want at a society wide level. Like last time me and you went to London, we got a pizza that was like, what was it, 3 foot long or something like that, and you know we a lovely Ben and Jerry's after, or Haagen-Dazs or whatever. And I love, like, I absolutely appreciate capitalism to death for making those things available for me. It's fantastic because I'm able to manage my health. I know how to back away from that. I know how to keep my health in order and everything. So I'm able to separate what I want for myself to be available, and what I think might be the best for public health. And I think that's probably one area where personal trainers and gym goers do struggle with this, because you know that you can kind of handle the temptation because it's just fine, but on a public health level it is a bit different. But anyway, if you do want to go and do some reading on kind of some of the public health stuff, like we talked about interventions, incentives, disincentives, etc., I would recommend checking out the Nuffield report on bioethics, I think it's called. But they even just look up the Nuffield intervention ladder, and it basically gives you a ladder of different levels of intervention, from very low levels of intervention to very high levels of intervention. Very low level of intervention would be, Boris Johnson coming out and saying, eat healthier for Britain, or something like that. Very high level of intervention would obviously be the example we gave with regards to Japan, like fining companies for hiring too many overweight people. Like that's clearly quite extreme on the other level of the intervention, or the other area, the other side of the intervention. Yeah, whatever. But yeah, check that out. Would recommend looking that up. There's a lot of good stuff in there in terms of integrating political philosophy into these types of discussions. You get an appreciation for like the philosophy of like John Milton Keynes, and how all these things integrate together from a philosophy, a politics, and a public health perspective. So get stuck in, and yeah, without further ado, I guess we will say goodbye. Where you can find us, guys, as always, if you're interested in the coaching process, you want to move away from all this public health junk, and you just want to get on the path with your own individual goals, we do offer coaching. So if you'd like to work with us, you can drop us an email. You can check out the link below. You can DM us individually. We don't mind. Reach out. Let us know what your goals are. We'll see if you're a good fit, if we're a good fit for you, and then we can book you on a call and hopefully give you some more information about the coaching process. Okay. Other than that, we do obviously have our coaches corner as well. So if you are a coach, you're interested in upskilling, you're interested in improving your education, your understanding of anatomy and physiology and nutrition theory and case studies, etc., get involved in the coaches corner. Would recommend. You can also subscribe to our Triage Method newsletter. Goes out every weekend, almost every weekend, and it contains lots of valuable information. We got some great feedback on our newsletter this morning, which I was very happy with. So I would recommend that you subscribe to that newsletter, because again, there's unique content that doesn't go anywhere else. So I would recommend subscribing. That also includes stuff that's not just from us. So we share recommendations from other resources, whether it be YouTube videos, research papers, books, podcasts, etc. So if you need more educational material, that's the place to go. We do also have a Facebook group, the Triage Method Community. So if you want to pop in there, ask us questions. If you're a personal trainer, you're having a difficulty with a client or something, feel free to share what's going on, and we can give you some advice, as can the other trainers that are in that group. And other than that, we just recommend following us on our social media platforms. So follow at Triage Method on Instagram, and you can also follow us individually on Instagram. So me at Skinny Gaz, Paddy at The Real Paddy Farrell, and then Brian, our nutritionist, at Brian O'Hangasa. Again, don't try and spell that, just look it up. Look up Brian OH and you'll find him on Instagram, or you'll find him on our pages.
USA. It'll probably come up there because his name does say USA.
Yeah, USA. It ends in USA.
USA.
So yeah, follow the podcast, guys, or subscribe to the podcast on the platform that you use. If you use a platform that offers you the opportunity to leave a review, then please do leave a review. And other than that, that's everything that we have for this week.
Yeah, I have nothing else to say. That was a very nice episode, and I hope people enjoyed it.
It's too easy.